Jess Menton. What are you watching, Jess?
So many different things and beyond the bank. So I'm actually looking ahead to next week because we will be getting earnings results from Netflix. So this is a company we need to focus on. Obviously used to be a part of the FANG names, not necessarily housed in the Magnificent Seven, but this stock just hit a 52-week high earlier this week. And all the rage has been when it comes to the crackdown with basically password sharing, right, Shonali? And so they rolled that out last summer. If you look at the second half of last year, they actually had a record amount of net subscriber growth, so around 22 million. It was a record for that half of that last year compared to that prior 6 months in 2022. So if you look at that, the question is how much longer can that growth continue? And Netflix actually put out a pretty wide margin. So if you look at the first quarter of last year, it was just under around 2 million. And then in the fourth quarter of last year, it was actually around 13. So it's a big range there to see how those numbers could play out. But that's something I'm watching looking ahead to next week.
You know, it's interesting. Speaking of some of this optimism in those big tech names, it begs the question about whether the idea behind them is changing as we hit some rockier times in the rest of the market. You see that certainly in a rocky day with Alphabet earlier hitting the $2 trillion in value mark after a nearly 15% rally this year. We know there are others that are really near that point too.
There are, Amazon in particular. So that stock just hit a record on Thursday. It actually, the last time it had a closing record was in July of 2021. So obviously we know this is one of the pandemic darlings. But then once shopping had cooled off and all of us got back into the world and we're spending our money on other things, that stock did get pressure. But of course, it's one of the last of the big 5 tech companies in the S&P 500 to be at a record recently. And then also just within striking distance of that $2 trillion valuation. So that's going to be key. The next big catalyst, of course, is looking ahead to later this month once Amazon does have those earnings results, Shonali.
Let's also talk about what's outside of just those traditional Mag 7 big tech names for a second and talk about the chip sector for a second.
That's
what are you
right.
seeing?
So Intel and AMD in particular are the big stocks that are under pressure this morning. So this did come after the Wall Street Journal did have an exclusive story looking at how China was directing some of its biggest telecom carriers to phase out their use when it comes to foreign chip makers by 2027. So not surprisingly, you would see Intel and AMD pressured by this because they are the biggest ones that are supplying a lot of this growth, not just for China, but globally as well. So you're seeing that as well. If you look over to the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index or the SOX, that's down more than 2% today. But again, putting into context, if you look at the SOX up about 15% year to date, outpacing the NASDAQ 100. And again, China has had issues in the past when it comes to these telecom carriers and other ones trying to be more reliant because hasn't been quite as good as more of those domestically focused chips. So it remains to be seen really how this all plays out. So even though we are seeing chip stocks pressured today, Shonali, overall this year, we're adding to those gains that we did see last year.
Bloomberg, Jess Menton, you are a star. Thanks for keeping an eye on all those things outside of the banks, in big tech, all over the place.